go ahead and start a few minutes early today to give the speaker time for his presentation. I think you'll find this very, very interesting. I'm pleased to welcome Denver Rawlings to speak to us. Denver is a West Virginia native, graduated from West Virginia University, later on got his MBA from Troy State, went to Vietnam, was 7 years in the armed forces, and had 2 tours of duty in Vietnam. His first tour of duty as a forward air controller flying what he calls candlestick missions. He'll tell you what those are. And after that, he volunteered for a second tour and came back and flew the F-4 fighter bomber, and he'll tell you about that and show you a model. He has 4 distinguished flying crosses. He has 19 air medals. I don't know how they put that many bronze stars on that air medal when he wears the ribbon. Maybe they just hang, you'll have to answer that, Denver. Do they just hang them down, or what do they do with all those extra bronze stars? And then he came back to Greenville and managed the Smith-Barney office for many years, where, interestingly, he worked with Doug Kelly, the late Doug Kelly, who was involved with the formation of this little group here within the Poinsett Club. But we're very happy to have him and thank him for his service and look forward to hearing about it. Denver, come on up.
Need to put this on, Bob?
Yes.
Testing?
Yeah, I think you just put it right on your tie right there
Okay.
would be the best.
All right. Good afternoon. Thanks for having me. I feel somewhat guilty because we've got Navy Cross recipients and Wild Weasels and other forward air controllers here from Pleiku and Army Vietnam veterans, but I'm glad to be here and honored, and thanks so much for a good turnout. Yesterday I got a call from a lady. It's a very good friend of mine. She was having problems with her son attending school. And I said, what do you want me to do? She said, I just want you to listen to me. I just want to vent, a little bit. And I said, so what seems to be the problem? And she said, well, Billy just doesn't want to go to school. And I said, well, what's the problem? He said, well, he goes to school and kids call him names, throw spitballs at him, write his name on the blackboard. They make all kinds of fun of him. Not any physical abuse, but just basically verbal abuse. And I said, what are you telling him? And she said, I've been going through this now for about a month, and I just keep telling him, you got to go to school, got to go to school. So what's he say? He said, you just give me 2 reasons I have to go to school, Mom. And she said, well, number 1, you're 51 years old. Number 2, you're the principal of the school. So the reason I mention that is because when you're flying, whether you're a forward air controller, you're in the back seat of an F-4, nothing is ever as it appears to be. Bob mentioned Doug Kelly, who was a very dear friend when we were here at Smith-Barney, and Doug and I used to have a few adult beverages after work. And we were sharing stories one night, and he was telling me about one of his missions with the base chaplain. Sometimes flight surgeons or base chaplains wanted to go up and fly one combat mission so they could get a patch. And like I flew over North Vietnam, or I flew in South Vietnam, or over the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And so this chaplain wants to go up and get orientation as to what forward air controllers do. So Doug said, I took him out. We're off base he was out in the Con Phenom. He was at NAILFAC, and I was at the Con Phenom also, but at different times. So we had a pretty good connection there. And he said he gets up and he said, Father, can you see that water buffalo down there in that rice paddy? And he said, yeah, I see it. And he said, well, let's just pretend that that's a target. That's a truck or a tank or, troop movement of some sort. And he said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to roll in and I'm going to mark a target, with smoke. So he said he rolls in, all of a sudden he hoses off a Willie Pete rocket, and he hits the water buffalo and it explodes. And the chances of doing that are about 10,000 to 1, probably about like getting a hole in one. The chaplain immediately starts crying and throws up in the cockpit. And Doug said, I returned to base immediately. It was the shortest mission I think I've ever been on. My first assignment, quite frankly, was dropping Agent Orange out of Fan Rang Air Force Base, and I got the orders, and I said, you got to be kidding me. I'm from a small town called Nitro, West Virginia. Monsanto Chemical Company made Agent Orange. We called it Weed Bug 2,4,5-T acid. I worked over there around the building between college semesters. And I said, you've got to be kidding me. Here I am, I'm thousands and thousands of miles away from Nitro, and I'm going to drop this stuff they're making in my hometown. Well, my good fortune, they canceled, they rescinded my orders, and I ended up going to Nakhon Phanom, known as Naked Fanny, which is about 8 miles from the Mekong River, 8 miles from Laos, and up in the far northeastern corner of Thailand. It was home to the 123, which I flew, the Candlesticks. It was a FAC flare mission. Home to the A-1 Sandies and the Jolly Green Giants, which were always participating in search and air rescue for downed pilots. You had nail FACs, you had Covey FACs. As I mentioned, that's what Doug flew. And our job was very simply to kill trucks. I would say about 90% of our missions were over the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a network coming out of North Vietnam. Bang Karai, Bang Ravine, and Magia Passes coming out. About 3,000 miles of roadways. And you had the roads memorized. That was part of your training. And so, you know, if you were taking off here, you'd be, you know, guiding the pilot. You're on the bottom of an airplane with, all you had to do was stick your hand out in the slipstream. You'd open up the door. You had a scope hanging down. It was about an 8-power, night-powered scope. Hopefully the moon was out. You could see the movers on the ground. Then you would drop mark, drop mark, drop mark. Hopefully you were close to the trucks. One night we had a guy actually drop a flare in a truck, and the instructions were hit my moving mark. Again, that was damn near impossible, but it happened that one night. It was probably one of the neatest missions I think you could ever fly. The flaring mission, quite frankly, was not too exciting. You just go up and you go in a circle for about 2.5 or 3 hours and then be replaced by another 123. But it was the people on the ground that you were supporting, the friendlies, might have been under attack that night. And I'm sure we did a little bit of that in South Vietnam, although most of it was in Laos. About 90% of the missions were over Laos, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. About 10% were over Vietnam. Just a couple of missions that I thought I would share with you before I get into the F4, which to me, going from the 124 or 123 was like going from, I would say, Little League Baseball, or certainly minor league baseball, up to the World Series. I mean, it was a whole different ball game in the F4, especially North Vietnam. But we had several interesting, missions. The first I can think of was when I first got into, Vietnam. We were looking at, I was on a mission one night, and you've got the route structure memorized. We're going down this route. Most of the trucks are coming south to go to South Vietnam. And I see a single truck, I see a mover, and I said, I got a mover below us, stand by to, drop these marks. So drop mark, drop mark, drop mark. We straddle the road, which is perfect. And we're working with a B-57 that night. And I said, we've got one single mover. And he said, yes, Raj, are we cleared in hot? And we were very cautious because several months before that, I was not there. We had a mid-air collision with a B-57. They got their east and west signals mixed up. And when you roll in, you're clearing somebody in hot, you're over here. And all of a sudden you roll in, by the time they come out, you're over here. Well, they got east and west mixed up. When they came out, they hit one another. It killed everybody aboard a B-57, 2 of them, and I think there were 7. So 9 people were killed in a mid-air collision. So we were very careful to make sure that he was rolling in from the right direction. He goes in, and all of a sudden I'm in the bottom of the aircraft to see if we're going to hit the truck. And I come out of the scope because it was like somebody took a flashlight or a flash bulb and hit it in your eye, because this thing intensifies the starlight about 1,001. And I went, wow. I said, my God. I said, what did you drop? He said, we dropped some thermite. It was like one of these old bombs that they dropped, I think, in Japan, carryover from World War II. And I said, well, I can't tell you whether you got the truck. And he said, oh, we got it. I said, well, how do you know? He said, we got sensing equipment. I dropped the bomb. And he said, you don't have to hit it. He said, it'll melt the engine and the truck. It's about 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. But it lit up. It looked like, the football stadium over at Clemson at night. It was just so incredibly bright, I couldn't believe it. Later on in the tour, we were going out on station because once you cross the Mekong, which was called the fence, you would say, you know, we're on station. And I was sitting in the back of the aircraft, and we had two of us that night, two forward air controllers, and one was already on the bottom of the airplane, getting set up with the scope and everything. And I look and I see a red light coming right at us. And I said, you know, they teach you that you're on a collision course if the light just stays the same place on the cockpit. And I said, this thing is coming right at us. And so we looked at our, you know, frag order sheet that night and said, well, you know, we've got a Spectre gunship out there, C-130 gunship, and we've got us, and we've got the gunfighters out of Da Nang that are going to be flying support in case we find some targets. But he's going to be at 10,000 feet, and we're going to be at 9,000 feet. And, you know, 2 or 3 minutes goes by, and I said, that light is still coming right at us. And all of a sudden, I hear the scope underneath the aircraft. It's on the bottom of the aircraft, let out a couple of 4-letter expletives, and about that time, we went up in the air about 5 or 6 feet. The 130 missed us by about 10 feet. They were at the same altitude. They were flying at the wrong altitude. If you'd have been in a commercial airliner, your head would have hit the luggage rack. That's how violent it was. And we had like 7 on our crew that night, I believe. I don't know how many in a 130. I would say a lot more than 7, but we would have killed probably at least 15 people. Most of the missions that we flew, like I said, were over Laos. One that sticks out in South Vietnam, I was in my trailer one night, and the door, somebody's knocking on the door, and I go to the door, and I see Alex Mason, who's a really good friend of mine. He was from Kannapolis, North Carolina, played freshman ball for NC State basketball, and we were very good friends. And I open up the door, and he's just white as a ghost. And I said, Alex, I said, what's going on? He said, we got hit tonight. And I said, did anybody get killed? He said, no, but he said, I'm going to warn you. He said, you're going down there next. And I said, oh boy, thanks. We're going down to some Delta site in Vietnam. He said, I don't know what's going on, some sort of offensive, but trucks are all over the place. And it hit us right in the tail. And if the shell would have been 2 or 3 feet higher, right, left, lower, whatever, it would have killed all of them. So he said, I want you to go out and look at it before you fly tonight. And right in the middle of the tail, there was this huge hole, about a 3 or 4 foot, diameter hole in the tail. So we get the good fortune of going back down there again. We didn't know whether it was luck or whatever, because they didn't shoot at us that much over the trail. So we go down, and as soon as we get on station, I'm seeing trucks just right and left. They look like little ants, going around like this. And most of the roads were fairly, straight, mild turns. But this one was, I could see they were going up a mountain because they're twisting and turning. And I said, I've got movers all over the place. I don't even know where to begin to, what targets to even strike. And so as we start to get ready to drop some marks, we start just really, really close AAA. I mean, it's coming up all around us. And I said, let's get ready, make another pass. Made another pass, and all of a sudden I'm down in a hole now, and I'm looking down. And when you're getting fired at, it accelerates at an increasing rate. If you've seen AAA, like some of you have in here. And all of a sudden it gets about right here, and I jump back in the aircraft and I yell brake. I said, we're going to get hit. And I get in and I cover up my eyes and ears. I thought, we had chutes on, and I said, if I can survive this, I said, I'll be able to get out of the aircraft. Then I yelled brake, which is your maneuver to get out of the AAA. And so it didn't hit us. And the pilot said, we need to get out of here. We're highly vulnerable. They've got radar guided AAA, which we had never seen before that far south. And I said, how close? And he said, it came up between the cockpit and the engine nacelle. Missed us by about 5 feet. So boom, we're out of there. Right after that, they phased us out. And I just read this on the internet. I never knew why they phased us out, but they said we were just way too vulnerable, for the, for the AAA and everything, in South Vietnam. Also, I flew one mission in an A1. I get over to Nakhon Phanom, and there was one fellow by the name of Tom Lyons. We'd gone to college together at West Virginia. I couldn't believe I ran into a fellow West Virginian in a bar, and I said, what are you doing here? Flying A1s. And I said, I've always wanted to fly in one of those. And he said, well, I'll get you a ride. All you got to do is come over and go through the ejection seat training. And I said, well, that's neat. So I went over the next day, and we got to fly in the daytime. All of our missions were at night, but these guys flew in the daytime. So we go up, and we're working with a Raven flak out of Laos. And he said, you've got my smoke. And I said, all of a sudden we just rolled in, and you're at about 45 degrees. and he drops a bomb, and all of a sudden he's got the machine guns. It looked like something on a World War II movie. I believe it was a World War II airplane. It was that old. It was rat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat. And I said, this is what I want to do. I want to be on the shooting end, not the telling him where to shoot, but I want to be on the shooting end. So I volunteered for a second tour, and they could see a sucker coming a mile away, and they said, if you volunteer for a second tour, we'll give you any airplane you want. We'll give you an RF-4, an F-4, a B-52, an F-111. Well, the F-111s are having some operational problems. B-52s just didn't do it for me. You know, you were high, you never really got shot at. You know, we all thought we were Tom Cruise, even though we weren't. And I said, well, I'm invincible. You know, I'm not going to get shot. Didn't want to be 52. I wanted to get shot at. I mean, it wasn't very bright in those days. And so I said, didn't want an RF-4. You couldn't shoot back. So I volunteered for an F-4. And I put in for Vietnam. I put in for Iceland. Put in for Alaska. I like to hunt and fish. And somebody had been to Reykjavik, and they said there's an awful lot of good-looking blondes up there. I was single in those days. So that was my thought process. I wanted to get shot at. I wanted to chase gals, and I wanted to hunt and fish. Typical fighter pilot. Then I put in the U.S. I put in Philippines and Korea, and so all of a sudden I get the Philippines, and I'm just sick. I didn't want the Philippines. I said, why would they tell me I can get in the airplane they want? It's like they're trying to entice you to go to Vietnam, and I get the Philippines. I said, this is ridiculous. So the first thing you got to do is go through RTU, replacement training units, because new troops have got to get over into Vietnam. And so I do get the F-4, and I go to George. And they made these models for us when I was in the Philippines. So anyway, I get in the F-4, just briefly designed in 1960. First started flying with the Navy. The Navy was the first to actually use them in combat. 29,000 pound airplane, carried 12,000 pounds of fuel. You would land, I believe, at 128 knots plus 2 knots for every 1,000 pounds you had of fuel on board. It would do about anything. It would fight, it would strafe, it would do air to air. You could drop chaff, you could drop any kind of bomb, napalm, CBUs, cluster bomb units, 500 pounders, 200,000 pounders. And it would go 2.2 Mach, but that's really kind of, you know, ridiculous, because in order to do 2.2 Mach, you'd have to take off these missiles. These are AIM-9 heat-seeking missiles, these white ones if you can see it. I'll leave this up here so you can see it. The ones on the bottom are AIM-7s built by Raytheon. They're forward-guided missiles. They got a range of about 8 miles if I remember correctly. But you'd have to clean up the airplane. You couldn't have a lot of stuff on it and be going 2.2. Only way you're going to do that is get up to 35,000 feet, push your stick forward, full forward, or not full forward, just negative G's, put it in afterburner. Of course, you're out of fuel pretty soon when you did that. So it wasn't really very practical. But it was an incredible, incredible airplane. The first mission, peacetime, I was with a guy named John Merritt, who used to fly with Robin Olds, Colonel Robin Olds, who became general and commandant of cadets at the Air Force Academy. I've heard that they're going to make a movie about him, but I've heard that for about 10 or 15 years, so I'm not holding my breath. Handlebar mustache, MiG killer, pearl-handled revolvers. I mean, he was like General Patton of the Air Force, and people loved him. And I asked John, I said, well, tell me a story about Olds. And he said, well, we're at the Officers Club one night in Dubon, which is home of the Wolf Pack, and they shot down several MiGs. And he said, one of the young lieutenants comes up one night, and he's had a little bit too much to drink, and he's telling Colonel Olds how to win the war. And he said, I don't need your help. And he said, yeah, but I want to tell you, General, how we're going to win this thing. He said, I don't need your help. And he comes back a third time, and Olds grabs him by the arm. Olds is a big man. Takes him into men's latrine, puts his head down the commode, flushes the commode. And he said, I want you to sober up. And he goes, okay, so I'm not through with you yet. Takes him outside and throws him in the clong, which clong is nothing but like a moat around the Officers Club with lily pads and junk and everything else. So Robin was loved by all of his men. He took no crap, but he was a heck of a pilot. So John said, what do you want to do today? First mission, orientation flight. And I'm like, young lieutenant. He's a captain. And I said, well, I need a flight plan. I need to figure out how much fuel we're going to use and, do this. He said, no, we're not doing that. He said, I don't have time for that. So he takes a string, and we got a board, and he pulls the string. He said, Lake Tahoe. He said, we got enough. I said, okay. He said, let's go. So we take off. We go through the mountains just west of George Air Force Base. And it's just gorgeous. And I said, man, this is the best decision I've ever made. You got snow-capped peaks, you got lakes and everything, and we go up to Lake Tahoe and we circle the lake. In the back, you've got an inertial nav system, and all you have to do is put in the coordinates, and it'll take you anywhere you want to go in the world. So he said, you ever seen Death Valley? And I said, no, not on the ground or in the air. And he said, put it in. So we, Death Valley, next thing you know, down. Only time I've ever been below sea level in an aircraft. It's minus 90 feet, and we're going about 40 feet below sea level, or below regular. And so we get down, and it's just, all you're seeing is a bunch of, cactus and everything. It's just a blur. So he said, you seen enough? And I said, yeah, I mean, this is neat. This is neat, John. All of a sudden, we pull up the airplane. We do about 6 aileron rolls just like this. And he said, put the base in. Of course, you've got 2 or 3 targets, and you just put the base in. And we're flying, and all of a sudden, I look, and there's Telescope Peak, which is part of the national park there at 29 Palms or Death Valley. And so I'm in the back seat, and I'm looking out, and I'm seeing this, peak up there, and I'm peeking up. And I said, John, you see the peak? No, he said, yeah, I see it. He said, don't worry. He said, we're cool. We get, a mile or two. I said, John, you sure you see the peak? He said, Denver. He said, relax. This is no problem. So all of a sudden, you go over the peak, and when you do that, your stomach just kind of, goes up to your throat, and he flips the airplane upside down, and he flies down the mountain upside down. And I'm going like, wow, this is pretty cool. I'm glad I did this. And I'm in the back seat, and I see this red light. It's a low-level fuel light. And I said, John, we got a low-level fuel light. I felt proud that I could finally do something, contribute to the mission after sitting back there just being goggle-eyed, He said, not a problem. George Tower, we got a straight in, just a final approach, and that was it. He said, I thought we'd have enough fuel. That was it. So right after that, I check into the Philippines. And I go to the Philippines and go into the squadron. It's a 2-story building, and there's nobody in there. And I thought, well, this is weird. We're at Air Force Base, Clark Air Force Base, the Philippines. There's nobody here. What's this all about? So I yell out, and somebody upstairs yells, up here! So I go up the stairs, and I get in there, and I look, and it's a major, and I'm a lieutenant, and I just said, Lieutenant Rawlings reporting, where you been? I said, I've been to San Francisco. He said, you're AWOL. And I said, no, I'm not AWOL. I hear my orders. I said, I just got here today. So I'm a little nervous. I'm sitting there, like, can I ask one question? And he said, sure. I said, where are we? He said, we're in the war. I said, what? He said, yeah, we're flying out of Udor, and we're flying combat in North-South Vietnam. And I thought, Philippines didn't turn out to be as bad as I thought. 9 days later, I'm in a dive bomb pass in South Vietnam. When I first got over there, some of you may recognize the name of Steve Ritchie. He's the Air Force's only pilot ace. And Randy Cunningham, which unfortunately, Navy ace, had other issues, but I remember meeting Steve Ritchie for the first time in orientation. Probably the cockiest fighter pilot, cockiest person I've ever met in my life. He's got his Nomex flight suit on. He's got an AIM-9 missile safety pin hanging out of his jacket so he could zip his zipper. Robin Old said he was one of the most brilliant pilots he's ever met, but he's also, he knew it, and he would let you know that he knew it. And I remember asking him a question. I said, well, what's the favorite mission? What's the mission du jour? Is it strafing? Is it this? And he said, there's only one mission as far as I'm concerned. That's killing MiGs. MiG Combat Air Patrol. And he said, that's the ultimate. And he just had this gleam in his eye, like giving Tom Brady a football, when it's a minute and a half left to go down the field. And he said, this is the ultimate. In mano a mano, 1 versus 1, you win, you lose, you die. And I thought, okay, this guy is a player. He was the only guy that ever, shot down 5 MiGs. 4 Silver Stars, 1 Air Force Cross, 10 distinguished flying crosses, 25 air medals, and 300 and some missions. And he tells a story about Roger Locker, not about one of his MiGs. He said, that's my second best story, but his best story was Roger Locker. Roger Locker was at Udorn when I was at Udorn. Roger's volunteered for 3 tours. He's flying with a guy named Major Robert Lodge. They attack 4 MiGs, North Vietnam. They're about 5 miles from Yen Bai Air Base. And a MiG-19 shoots him from behind, one they didn't see. So Lodge had said before the flight that he would never be taken prisoner because they had sophisticated gear on these airplanes, and he didn't want to be tortured as a POW. Well, they punch out. They don't hear from Roger for 22 days. And Steve Ritchie was in the flight where he was shot down, and all of a sudden they're back up 22 days later, and it's like, this is Oyster 1 Bravo. And Ritchie says, I remember, because you had different call signs. Oyster 1 Bravo. He said, God, he said, that's Roger Locker. And you know what Locker says? He said, I've been down here for a few days. When y'all going to pick me up? Ritchie said, I could not believe how cool and calm and collected he was. They go in there that day, try to pick him up, and they get fired upon by Yen Bai Air Base. They couldn't get in. The next day, General Voigt, who was a 7th Air Force commander, sends a mission of 150 aircraft to get Roger Locker out. And they rescue him this time, the Jolly Green Giants out of NKP, the base that I was at previously. And I just watched a video of Steve Ritchie talking about this. And at 1900 hours in the Udor Officers Club, they escort Locker in after they've shaved him and deliced him and picked the ticks off of him or whatever you do when you're in the jungle for 22 days. And where was I? I was asleep. I was over in my quarters, and I remember these guys were very, very drunk, and they were screaming and yelling, and I'm like, good gosh, I got a mission. I got to get up at like 4 in the morning. And here's a bunch of drunks, you know, and I said, it just sounds awfully loud and noisy. And finally I hear somebody else that's just taken off for a mission and leaving, and he said, what's going on? He said, they found Roger Locker, and they got him. And that's the only time I ever cried. Had a big tear coming down my eyes. And I'm like, go Air Force. I mean, that was really a highlight, I thought, of my tour, or one of them. Again, I told you, sometimes I'm not the brightest guy in the world, and I went up to the operations manager and I said, look, I've been over here now for, about a month or so, and I said, I've been shot at, I've already flown over 100 missions as forward air controller. I said, I want to volunteer for the heavy missions, we call them, North Vietnam. And so he said, fine, I'll put you on schedule tomorrow. So I remember so much about that particular day. It was the 4th of July, 1972. A lot of you were probably at a picnic or, going to a baseball game or something. I was getting ready to fly my first mission. And I still remember like it was yesterday that Farrell Sullivan, Lieutenant Colonel, right in front of me at 1 o'clock at the breakfast table. I had Chuck Large, who reminded me of Clint Eastwood. He was about that cool and cocky. And I was eating blueberry pancakes, and I remember Chuck turned over to Sully, who's our squadron commander, and he said, if we get shot down today and we have to go through Hanoi as POWs, we're in a guide off of Denver. And he looked and he said, what are you talking about? He said, well, you've marched before. When you march, you take the shortest guy and you put him on the right when you go by the stand. He said, you're sick. He said, you're sick. And he said, you got to have a sense of humor if you're going to get captured or you're going to die. And he says, I won't be captured. And I thought, well, okay. And he said it in such a tone of voice that I believed him. So we finish breakfast, we go into the briefing room. Large room, I'm going to say there's probably 75 to 100 of us in there. And of course the full colonel comes in, we're all, at ease men. We called this guy Press On Smith because every time he would talk to us afterwards, he'd say, press on, men, press on. Real military, had a white towel wrapped around him at all times. Looked like John Thompson from Georgetown. And so I'm sitting here trying to figure out, what the first mission is going to be. And we've got a board behind us with a map. It's a shade pulled down, and all of a sudden the shade goes up. He points to the target. He says, today, men, our target is downtown Hanoi, the Air Defense Center. I said, okay. I looked over at Carl, affectionately known as Magnet Ass by the squadron, because every time you flew with him, he just happened to get, he'd be a magnet for SAMs and AAA. So I looked at Carl and I said, I thought we could bomb a zoo or a truck park or a library or something today, Carl. He said, no such luck. And he said, Dobby Flight, you will be the chaff droppers. That's us. Chaff, if you've ever dropped it, you're like going down a crystal clear lake. Everybody behind you in the wake is hidden from enemy radar, but you're the lead. We had lost 4 or 5 airplanes, you know, in flying chaff drop. And I said, well, it just keeps getting luckier and luckier, you know, and get downtown Hanoi, you get to drop the chaff. And, you know, you asked for it, you got it, Toyota. So it gets better. I get in the briefing room, and so Chuck Large asked Sully, he says, so what are we going to do for SAM evasion? Because you're pretty sure you're going to get shot or jumped by MiGs or, you know, always going to get shot at. He said, we're not going to try to evade them. And I thought, oh, it just keeps getting better. I said, well, what are we going to do? And he said, we're going to turn on the ECM pods, electronic countermeasure pods. Well, I'd been to fighter weapons school and came back. It was like a 3-day special course as an instructor. And a SAM will guide on a frequency. And the ECM pods, electronic countermeasure pods, will work if the SAM is on that frequency. If it's on a different frequency, it has no effect. And I thought, you've got to be kidding me. Well, you didn't argue. I mean, there wasn't any of this stuff like you see in Apocalypse Now, you know, all of this Hollywood stuff. You just shut up. And I looked over at Carl and I said, you know, you got to be kidding me. So a few hours later, 090, typical Pentagon heading, either 090 or 270, real innovative, 17,000 feet, Dobby Flight. And we get a SAM fired at us. And it's at 8 o'clock. We were in an F4E model, and I couldn't get the volume on my raw gear, radar homing and warning device, turned down. So it was just like somebody screaming in your ear the whole time. And I'm like, God, it's bad enough you're getting shot at. Now all of a sudden I can't talk to Carl. So I have to turn it off. And I said, he said, we got a missile at 8 o'clock. And I said, I know. I said, I don't see it. You don't see it. You don't see it. And I said, no, I don't see it. I'm looking. Believe me, I'm looking for the SAM. I don't see it. And all of a sudden I hear an expletive come out. He said, turn to the right. And I look, then the SAM hits lead. And this was about here to that patio. We're in pod formation. The missile comes up between us and 3 and hits him. And so I see Dick Francis jump out of the aircraft, and Sullivan, true to his word, he never jumped out. And I kept watching it, and I can still have dreams about it occasionally. The airplane, it just kept, you know, moving and moving and moving, and like it didn't slow down. I kept saying, well, when is it going to slow down? And finally, the nose just pitched up a little bit, and it just started in a spin. And I kept watching and watching and watching. I never did see, you know, Sullivan, you know, bail out. Clip Clippinger was number 3. I just saw him end of April at squadron reunion. And all of a sudden, he just says, join up, and boom, we go on the decks. Fastest I've ever been in an F4 in an airplane, 602 knots. I remember seeing on the, you know, the airspeed indicator, and that was it. We lost our squadron commander. He never found him. We finally got his remains, and you know, gave him a military burial. The other mission that I thought was quite exciting was we finally drew MiGCAP, MiG Combat Air Patrol, and you'd go up and you would circle over Thud Ridge until the MiGs came up and tried to attack the strike force, and then you attack the MiGs. So we hadn't been up there very long, and all of a sudden, Red Crown, which is a ship out in the Gulf, Tonkin, says, we got 2 Blue Bandits, MiG-21s, out of Guillaume Airport, and, you know, Vector 120 to intercept. We said, Roger. That's what you live for, quite frankly. I mean, you was excited, there's no fear, just, you know, you just wanted to go get the MiGs. I mean, I think we would have done anything to get a MiG, and all of a sudden, we're flying along. We're number 4. I'm with a guy named Dave Coatsworth, and he's an Air Force Academy graduate, and we're flying along, and all of a sudden, Ivy McCoy, who's a flight lead, said, I got the MiG, and I'm like, well, I got a MiG too. And I tell Coach, I said, I got a MiG-21 at 2 o'clock high, real shiny and silver. They didn't camouflage them, and all of a sudden I look, this must have taken several seconds, and all of a sudden lead disappears. So we're out there number 4, which is usually the guy that gets shot down. It's like playing whip when you're a kid. You whip around, and the last guy on the end of the whip is the guy that that gets thrown out, and that's the guy that gets shot down. And I'm like, I thought for a second, well, maybe you ought to go after the MiG, and I thought, nah, you're always supposed to support lead. So all of a sudden I hear lead say, I'm engaged, I'm engaged, I'm engaged. I said, well, that's good. I said, Ivy's on him. But I said, we got to find him. You know, so we started looking around. I look, and he's coming straight at us. And I said, Coach, I said, you see Ivy? I said, he's coming straight at us. He said, I don't see him. I said, he's straight at us. It's sort of like me and the Sam. I couldn't see the Sam. He couldn't see Ivy. And I said, you got to take it down, or I'm taking the stick. And all of a sudden, you know, he's right up on top of us, and both of us just take the stick and go full forward. And we're just like this. And all of a sudden you get, you know, the stab augs, which kind of stabilizes the wings and everything. We kind of lose control, and we're just fluttering down like this. And I said, Coach, he says, you know, he said, I lost control. He said, I can't get it to come under control. And I said, yeah, good. That's great. I said, I'm punching out at 6,500 feet. Somehow I'd calculated at altitude because you got a downward vector. You can't wait till you're 10 feet off the ground if your VVI is 3,000 or 4,000 feet or whatever. I said, I'm punching out at 6,500 feet. He gets control of the airplane at about 7,000, and we pull out. About the time we pull out, I hear Ivy say, you know, Fox 1. Fox 1, I believe, was aim 9. Fox 2 was aim 7. Fox 3 was a gun. He said, Fox 1. And I said, well, he shot at him. All of a sudden, splash, one MiG-21, which means kill. And I look over and I see the airplane. It's blown to smithereens. And I see the pilot coming down. And I asked Coach, I said, are we supposed to arm up the gun and shoot the pilot and the parachute? He says, I don't know. I don't know what the protocol is. And you think I'm kind of sick for thinking that, but when I was at Nakhon Phanom, we had a briefing one night. They always brief you on who was shot down. One of the pilots was shot down, and as he was coming down, North Vietnamese were shooting at him with ZSU-23 while he's in the parachute. And that was the only nightmare that I think I ever had recurring. And I just felt like I was coming down in a chute. So I didn't really have a lot of sympathy for him because what's fair for one is fair for the other. We had one mission one time over Dong Hoi, if you will, and it was a port city just north of the DMZ. And just real quickly, I mean, as we were striking the target, we got a SAM fired at us. It exploded before it hit us. And all of a sudden, there's just a wall of flak. I mean, just straight up. And there was just no evading. You were going to get shot down if you went into it. So we just go straight vertical, afterburner up in the air, get up above the flak. And our attitude indicator starts tumbling, which was really wasn't a problem. So we get up, we call Red Crown. They said, divert into Da Nang, get your attitude indicator fixed. So I come back a day later, and the backseater on with lead, I said, y'all made it out? And he said, yeah. And I said, you didn't get hit or anything? He said, you guys went high, we took it low. I said, what do you mean? He said, we went below the AAA. And I said, how do you go below a gun? He said, we got on the river, and he said, we were doing 500 knots. We're going on the river about 20 feet. And he said, the tail in the F4, as you can see, these engines back here are canted slightly. He said, it's throwing up a rooster tail like you see in a speedboat. He said, I don't know what was more afraid, the Vietnamese or us, see us going down the river at 500 knots. I said, well, I'm glad you made it out. So we get, they pulled us out of the Philippines right before the B-52s, came in. And anyway, I remember being on the flight line, and I had several friends that were POWs, and I made a sign. I've always kept it. I'm sure it's real valuable. You can see why I was not a advertising agent when I got out of the Air Force. This was for Sam Cusimano, and I got his attention on the bus, and actually got to shake hands with him. But they put all the POWs in the hospital, for I think it was 2 or 3 days, and to de-lice them, to debrief them, any kind of sickness that they had, and so they were just, sort of incubated for a while. But it was an accompanied tour at the Philippines. You had wives and you had, teachers, nurses, doctors, families out there on the flight line. We were all on the flight line. And the first guy that gets off the airplane, I never will forget, he gets off, and it's a Navy officer, and I stuck my hand out and I said, welcome home. And he said, good to be home. And I said, I know it's not home, but you know what? He said, yeah, I know. And he wouldn't leave. And I said, I hope the bombing helped. And he said, it definitely did. He said, I could hear him and I could see him out the window. And I said, well, that's good. And I said, if we have to do it over again, we would. He said, I really appreciate that. He's also known as Senator John McCain right now. And I've never forgotten that. And he was a hero beyond heroes, I think, in POW camp. We finally got to see the POWs, and you know, the newspaper people were there. Peter Arnett, who won the Pulitzer in 1966 for his coverage of Vietnam, came over to the house for dinner. At that time, I was living in a 4-bedroom house called the Palace. There's 4 of us fighter pilots. You had a live-in maid, a yard boy, and all this sort of thing. So Peter comes over. I remember he bought us a bottle of Courvoisier brandy. And he said, y'all want to smoke some marijuana? And I'm like, I don't think that's a very good idea, Peter. I mean, you know, I can see that in the Stars and Stripes or the New York Times, Washington Post the next day. I said, no, we're not going to do that. And so he wrote an article, an incorrect one, in my opinion, about the POWs having relations with the nurses and this and that, and took a couple shots. And I saw him, you know, the next day at the officers club, and I said, why did you write that article? And he said, well, the pen's mightier than the sword. He said they wouldn't cooperate with us. They wouldn't let us see the POWs. I said, Peter, they've got to debrief them. They've got to, you know, get them well. They've got to, you know, make sure there's no problem. He said, well, that's just the way life is. In 1999, he was fired from CNN. He had released a report about special ops going into Laos and releasing sarin gas to kill defectors from the military. And they canceled the story. And then in 2003, he's fired again from NBC for talking to the Iraqis on TV and giving his opinion on the war. So I think I had him pegged pretty accurately. I see Dick Francis, who was the backseater that survived and jumped out. And I said, Dick, I said, what's the scarring on your face? And he said, well, when I bailed out, he said, the bayonet clip on the oxygen mask, you know, just tore my face up. He said, we were going at 420 knots, 7 knots a minute. And I said, well, why would you have your oxygen mask off? He said, I was smoking in the cockpit. Can you imagine being on a Delta flight, you know, and the pilot coming out of there and he's smoking a cigarette? And here we are on a combat mission, and he's, you know, he's smoking a cigarette. I'm like, you got to be an absolute nut job. So back to the Philippines. One really quick story about the Philippines. Bob, how are we doing on time? We got
105.
We're okay? We're 5 minutes or 5 minutes. So we go back to the Philippines, and before I moved into the Palace, I was rooming with a guy named Jim Peck, and you end up handing car down to car. And he had bought a bronze Barracuda, and it had those spinner hubcaps on it. And he said, you heard about the guy that was in here before me? And I said, no. And he said he was an intel officer. And he had a little Negrito, like a pygmy for a houseboy. They were natives. And he said, I told him, he says, you know, Dotto, he says, I don't want my hubcap stolen anymore. And he says, no problem, boss, no steel hubcap. So he wakes up one morning, he's going to work, and he comes out, and there's a Filipino with his throat slit, and he's dead as a doornail in the street. And the major just, you can imagine getting up, go out and get your Sunday paper, and there's a guy with his throat slit. And he panics, he goes back into the house and calls the base, and I got a dead guy out here. He didn't know whether it was a Huck communist or what. And he runs into Dotto, and he says, Dotto, he says, there's a guy that's dead here. And he says, me no, boss. He says, no steel hubcap, no more. He had caught him. They didn't have any laws. They just absolutely slit his throat. I flew one time with Bud Day, who's a Medal of Honor recipient. Medal of Honor, Navy Cross, Air Force Cross. I don't know how many, 4 Purple Hearts. They'd broken his arm in Vietnam in the same place. And I was flying with him, and Colonel Westbury, who was the operations manager, said, Dunbar, I want you to fly with Colonel Day today. He said, he's got a tendency to get too low on the gunnery range, and we've had some damaged aircraft. And on the strafe, when you go down, as you well know, you go down and the bullets come back up and they ricochet and you can hit them. Well, the windscreen in the F-4 is about that thick. So we're going out to the airplane. I said, Colonel Day was just a miraculous person. He just died a few months ago. I said, you know why I'm with you today, don't you? And he said, yeah, I said, I think so. He said, they don't want me getting real low, do they? And I said, no, Colonel Day. I said, that's right. So I said, I'm going to call out the altitude. So we roll in, and a minimum, I believe, was like 250 feet. And when you roll in, you're up, I don't know, 7,000 or 8,000 feet, and the target looks like a postage stamp. It's actually a big sheet that's probably like twice as big as those curtains. So we go in, 900, 800, 700, 600, 500, 400. I said, Colonel Day, you need to start firing. 300, 200, 150, and he just about flies into the curtains. He goes, he said, I think I got it, Denver. And I said, I think if you could hit that window right there with a pistol, you could get it. Last story I'll tell real quickly is one peacetime story. My college roommate got married in the Florida Keys, and I went down for the wedding. I was invited down for his sister-in-law's wedding in the Florida Keys, and we were at Eglin Air Force Base at this time. And I said, you know, Diane, I said, I got an idea. I said, they were in Alamorada, Florida, just north of Key West. I said, I'll fly down the F4, and I said, you know, we'll do a flyby. And she said, oh, my dad would love that. So we go down under the guise of doing approaches at Key West Naval Air Station. We go down there and we do that. We come back. I'd been to the house. There was a large jetty that protruded out from the coastline there. He had a swimming pool in the backyard and a big ham radio tower. So I told Ray, I said, I think I've got it. And he said, yeah, that's it. I said, that's it. So we fly over the fishing fleet. He's a fishing captain, Dick Williams Coral Cove Resort. Rock the wings, come around, go around Route 1, come back, you know, go back over the fleet, rock it again, come back, hit the swimming pool, pull it up, do about 6 aileron rolls. Didn't think a thing about it. Come down there for the wedding next week, and you would have thought that I was either the President of the United States or Superman or King Kong, I don't know, but it was like you walked into the room, they're having a cocktail reception for the wedding, and he was just introduced. He said, this is the guy that did it. And he says, I got to tell you something. He said, you almost got into trouble, though. And I said, what do you mean? He says, there was a lady staying in one of her cottages. She's married to a retired Air Force general. And it just scared the living hell out of her. She thought we were under attack because you had the Cuban defector came over in, I think, a MiG-19 or something, and she thought we were under attack. And she literally dove underneath the bed in the cottage. And she gets, you know, her husband gets home with a fishing trip, and she's telling him about it. He's like, you wouldn't believe it. So he's upset now. He calls Homestead Air Force Base up the road. We weren't out of Homestead, we were out of Eglin. And they said, well, did you get a tail number? And he said, hell no, I didn't get a tail number. They're going too fast. And he said, nothing we can do, but we didn't have anybody down here. So that was my last fun mission, I guess. And we didn't get shot at either. That was pretty nice. I'll just leave you with one closing thought. First of all, if you haven't read this book and you like some of these stories that I just related to you, read this Hunter Killers. It's about the wild weasels. The Colonel can probably share a few stories. It's one of the neatest books I've ever read. We both got a friend in Leo Thorsis, Medal of Honor recipient. Chapter 7 is in here. It is all about Leo. I'll just leave you with these thoughts, or this one thought. War is an ugly thing, but not the ugliest of things. A decayed and degraded state of mind that thinks nothing is worth war is much worse. Any individual who values his personal safety more than his individual freedom can only be kept free by men better than himself. Thank you.
Okay,
Yeah, sure. Be happy to.